Have you ever wondered how new cancer drugs come to market and why they are priced the way they are? In this episode, I talk with world-renowned cancer researcher and molecular biologist, Dr. Bryan Williams. Dr. Williams' career spans nearly 4 decades, and during that time, he's worked for the Cleveland Clinic and now is Emeritus Director and Distinguished Scientist at the Hudson Institute of Medical Research in Melbourne, Australia. He's also a professor in the Department of Molecular and Translational Science at Monash University. Dr. Williams explains how research priorities for cancer research are established, as well as where the funding for this work comes from. Now, listeners familiar with high-technology venture funding will notice many parallels in this development and financing process. But as Dr. Williams notes, there are important differences as well. The investment return horizons for this kind of research are much longer. Think 10 to 15 years. The development timeframes are much longer. The risk can be very high, and exits and liquidity events are most often an M&A transaction where the biotech firm is acquired by a big pharma company. Dr. Williams explains why this is the most frequent liquidity event for these startups. So join me in my conversation with Dr. Williams and gain valuable insights into the process and business of cancer therapy development. Because I'm just trying to think of the societal impact, and I'm looking at this like a businessman. There's a cost-benefit analysis here. There are some cancers, and again, I don't even know which ones, but I would assume that would be very widespread. And then there's others, like you just mentioned, that would be more rare. And so how, in terms of allocating funding, how do they go about that process of saying we want to put money here as opposed to there? What does that look like?
That question wasn't being addressed very well 30 odd years ago. Certainly when I started in the field more than 40 years ago, was not addressed at all.
Right.
You had specialists who worked in the areas. You had researchers who jumped around and investigated different things, following the biology, interested in the biology, and maybe finding a little bit more about the biology of a particular disease would lead to some sort of intervention. But I think the best example of identifying a cancer that had a large unmet need was breast cancer. So it was really, really not treated very well. Women were developing breast cancer and dying from breast cancer when they should have been detected and treated more effectively and efficiently. And these days it certainly is. Now, women still unfortunately die of specific forms of breast cancer that can be quite deadly, but in the main, women are very well treated with breast cancer now. And it's a combination of changes in diagnostic techniques. So mammography is becoming much more prevalent, undergoing them much earlier than normal during the course of a woman's lifetime. That's been a really important advance. And then also the therapy has advanced. It's much better therapy. And again, with breast cancer, it's a combination therapy of radiation and chemo that's used in most cases.
To what degree do you think, thinking back, let's say 3 decades, to what degree do you believe that the emphasis that was then placed on finding cures for breast cancer was the result of societal pressure?
Yes, I think that's right, because women's diseases generally were understudied. And when I moved to the Cleveland Clinic, I was recruited by Bernadine Healy. She was the research director at the Cleveland Clinic. She subsequently went on to be director of the National Institutes of Health. And when she was at the National Institutes of Health, she pushed very, very hard for women to be more represented in clinical trials, for example.
Interesting.
And diseases that were specific to women, such as breast cancer. There was an increase in the interest and funding, importantly, funding for research into that cancer and other cancers that particularly affect women.
I'm your host, Mark Good, and this is Remarkable, a podcast focused on people and stories worthy of your attention. And now, today's show. Well, I just want to welcome Bryan Williams to another episode of my Remarkable podcast. Bryan, how are you today?
I'm fine, thank you, Mark, and thanks for the invitation to come and speak to you today.
Well, I appreciate it very much. I'm sure people who are listening to this in the United States will immediately pick up on your accent. Tell the listeners where you're from and then kind of what's brought you here.
Well, I'm born in New Zealand, educated in New Zealand right through to a PhD, and then I moved to London, England for a postdoctoral fellowship, began a faculty position at the University of Toronto after that, and then moved to Cleveland after 12 years in Toronto.
Wow.
Where I worked at the Cleveland Clinic for 15 years.
Okay.
And following that, I moved to Australia, where I ran a research institute for another 13 years.
Wow.
And now I come back to Cleveland. For the last 5 years, I come back to Cleveland and I consult in commercialization of their discoveries. So moving discoveries through to products potentially that can improve patients' lives. So that's the work that I'm doing for the clinic. I do it remotely, but at the same time, I like to come here for about a couple of months, 2 or 3 months a year, so I can meet with all the folks that I see over Zoom and Teams and get to know them in a more personable way.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So for those, again, who haven't looked at your Wikipedia page, talk a little bit about what your specialty is. You know, you got a PhD, postdoctoral research, you've run a variety of research institutes. What's the focus of your work been over these many decades?
It has been in the area of innate immunity. So that's a system that exists within us to protect us from virus infections that are running around the community at any time. And people who don't have an intact innate immunity system, they really do suffer from serious infections and frequently will succumb to those. But most of us have a very active innate immune system. That's what I began working on my PhD, and I followed that track for quite some time. And then I moved into the intersection between innate immunity and cancer. So innate immunity, it's there, it's ready to be activated by any bacterial or virus infection.
Right.
Once you've had a bacterial or virus infection, that's when your acquired immunity system is geared in, it kicks in, and it can protect you from a subsequent infection.
So that's interesting because I was not aware until very recently that there are any cancers that can be caused by a virus. Is that correct? There are some, correct?
Yeah, oh, yes, that's right. I mean, and in fact, there's that's been one of the really great advances over the past 20 years or so is identifying those cancers that are caused by a virus and then being able to vaccinate against that virus.
And of course, the vaccination, I assume, would operate because it takes advantage of this innate immune system, correct?
That's correct. It takes advantage of the innate immune system, which has to be activated by the vaccine, in addition to stimulating an acquired production of antibodies against a subsequent infection, or indeed what's called a cellular response. So these are specialized cells that can also kill infected cells.
Okay.
Target and kill. So we have antibodies that can bind to the virus.
Right.
Or we have cellular immunity that can attack the virus-infected cells.
Now this, so let's focus in on those sort of viruses that cause cancer, or cancers, I should say, plural. Are those sorts of remedies that are applied, in other words, vaccines, this is not like a radiation therapy, a chemotherapy, et cetera.
No, that's absolutely correct. It's vaccination against virus infections is a true vaccination.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So in that case, it's far less. I guess there's far less corollary damage to the affected person's body. Correct.
Now these vaccines are very safe. They're also so in the case of cervical cancer, which is caused by a virus. You know that the cervical cancer vaccines have been now distributed in the community worldwide.
Right.
And they're very, very protective against transmission of the virus, which causes the cancer.
Okay.
Yeah. And so now children are vaccinated against getting developing cervical cancer later on, mostly it's a female
Right.
disease. And a dreadful disease that was not able to be treated effectively by any form of therapy. But the vaccine is very, very protective. So that vaccine resulted from discoveries made in the US and also by an Australian group.
Really?
Yeah.
So tell me, when I hear the word cancer, and I'm not obviously well-informed or well-educated about this, but when I hear the word cancer, of course, it looms large in most people's minds, right?
That's right.
What kind of percentage of cancers that affect people are caused by viruses, and then what are caused by other things?
It's a minority that are caused by viruses.
Okay.
So we have a handful that are caused by viruses.
Okay.
Most of them are caused by either a genetic predisposition, because sometimes during our development,
Right.
we've undergone some sort of change in our DNA,
Okay.
and that predisposes us to cancer later on. Sometimes during childhood, but oftentimes doesn't manifest itself until much later. An example of that would be the gene called BRCA1, BRCA1.
Yes.
That you've probably heard about,
heard of that,
and
yeah.
breast cancer.
Right.
So that manifests itself obviously much later than a childhood cancer.
So do we know why or what causes these defective genes to be passed on?
Well, it so happens that this is a very, very common thing that we all carry very, very different profile when it comes to determining the genes that we have in the genome that's driving our development. I'll give you an example. I worked on a childhood cancer called Wilms tumor. And when I worked on it, we knew that there was likely a gene that caused Wilms tumor, but we hadn't identified it. So we spent a long time trying to identify this gene. Where was it? In that time, we didn't even know how many genes there were in the human genome. We know there's 20-odd thousand now. And we managed to define exactly where that gene was. Now, did that help us cure the cancer? No, it did not, because the cancer was cured in children through traditional means. Traditional means I mean by that, radiation treatment and chemotherapy treatment.
Okay.
So they were quite effective once that was detected.
But identifying the gene as the causal element, did that help in diagnosis?
It did, and it also helped it understand how that cancer formed. That's right. So this is a mistake that happens during the development of what's called the urogenital system. So that's the kidney and your genital system.
Interesting. And so that genetic mistake, to use your word, that develops, is this in utero?
Correct. That's right. Very early on during what we call embryogenesis, during development of the embryo.
Okay.
And so what we learned about once we discovered, our group and others had learned a lot more about the gene, we could then figure out why was it required during a precise time during development, and how if this failed, did that lead to cancer? So it's a matter of switches, really. So you've got to switch genes on and off. And this resulted in a failure to switch certain genes off or turn other ones on.
Interesting. Were the researchers, and I assume this includes yourself, able to then determine the appropriate, if you will, switching sequence, which ones need to be off, which ones need to be on?
Yes, that's right. There was very detailed analyses of that done over the past 25 years or so, and so we know a great deal about that now. Yeah.
So, rolling the tape backwards, when I read, again, just as a consumer, and I also think about when I've gone to see the doctor and an annual checkup, and one of the questions I always ask is, do any of your have any of your parents had cancer?
Yes,
right?
yes.
Either of your parents, right? How about a brother or a sister, et cetera?
Yeah.
Again, this is, I guess, trying to flag early on, or in that diagnosis of me or checkup of me whether or not I have a genetic predisposition towards cancer?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, and it's wise of your general practitioner to ask those questions as well. So, is it, for example, males, prostate cancer in the family? Any familial link to prostate cancer? This is usually you're not talking about distant relatives here. You're talking about relatives that are much closer.
Immediate.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So, and they'll ask those questions, and then they can determine whether or not you should be followed more closely. So, if there's a predisposition to prostate cancer, it's it's good to have a checkup more frequently than otherwise. Colorectal cancer, similarly, and a number of cancers.
Interesting.
Their genetic predisposition.
There's an enormous amount of money that's been invested in finding, if you will, cures for cancer. Within that world of cancer research, how are priorities determined? How do research organizations say we're going to focus on this cancer as opposed to that cancer? I mean, is there some sort of international body, or is it just done by? I mean, how is that done?
Well, it's usually specialized. So if you're talking about things like kidney cancer, bladder cancer, cancers of the urogenital system, as I mentioned in that system before, then that's usually tackled in society meetings. Urological society meetings. So these would be clinical meetings.
Right.
And then also by specialized meetings in broader cancer societies, the American Society for Cancer Research, for example, AACR, that will have focused sessions on the different forms of cancer to attract researchers into those to present their data, share and challenge other folks' data, and move the field forward. So that's how it's organized. And then also every now and again there's a push to do more on rare cancers, these cancers that are seldom seen. So they're often very, very difficult to treat and often quite deadly. So you'll find there's a specialized group will be formed to do a lot more work on that. Perhaps the government, through its funding agencies, National Institutes of Health, will identify a rare cancer as one that needs more work performed on it to then provide some avenue for a therapeutic approach.
So, because I'm just trying to think of the societal impact, and I'm looking at this like a businessman. There's a cost benefit analysis here. There are some cancers, and again, I don't even know which ones, but I would assume that would be very widespread. And then there's others, like you just mentioned, that would be more rare. And so how, in terms of allocating funding,
yes,
how do they go about that process of saying we want to put money here as opposed to there? What does that look like?
That question wasn't being addressed very well 30 odd years ago. Certainly when I started in the field more than 40 years ago, it was not addressed at all.
Right.
You had specialists who worked in the areas. You had researchers who jumped around and investigated different things, following the biology, interested in the biology, and maybe finding a little bit more about the biology of a particular disease would lead to some sort of intervention. But I think the best example of identifying a cancer that had a large unmet need was breast cancer. So it was really, really not treated very well. Women were developing breast cancer and dying from breast cancer when they should have been detected and treated more effectively and efficiently. And these days it certainly is. Now, women still unfortunately die of specific forms of breast cancer that can be quite deadly, but in the main, women are very well treated with breast cancer now. And it's a combination of changes in diagnostic techniques. So mammography is becoming much more prevalent, undergoing them much earlier than normal during the course of a woman's lifetime. That's been a really important advance. And then also the therapy has advanced. It's much better therapy. And again, with breast cancer, it's a combination therapy of radiation and chemo that's used in most cases.
To what degree do you think, thinking back, let's say 3 decades, to what degree do you believe that the emphasis that was then placed on finding cures for breast cancer was the result of societal pressure?
Yes, I think that's right, because women's diseases generally were understudied. And when I moved to the Cleveland Clinic I was recruited by Bernadine Healy. She was the research director at the Cleveland Clinic. She subsequently went on to be director of the National Institutes of Health. And when she was at the National Institutes of Health, she pushed very, very hard for women to be more represented in clinical trials, for example.
Interesting.
And diseases that were specific to women, such as breast cancer. There was an increase in the interest and funding, importantly, funding for research into that cancer and other cancers that particularly affect women.
Yeah, I've read that before, that, again, women are, or have been, that this may have changed by now, but in the past had been horribly underrepresented on a variety of fronts relating to medical care and attention. And but I used to live in the state of Texas, and I believe the Susan Komen Foundation came out of Dallas, I believe. And I remember the pink ribbons and the marches and all that sort of stuff happening. But until I spoke with you, I've never really seen the connection between all of that emphasis from a social standpoint and the movement of money.
Yes.
So it sounds like it was effective.
That's right. Well, the Susan Komen Foundation was very effective because they also had an annual meeting that encouraged more researchers into the field to present their data, not a highly focused meeting.
Right.
It's been very important, that foundation. And other foundations, similarly, foundations for ovarian cancer, for example, were critical in terms of making sure that when funding decisions are made, these forms of cancer are up there and are taken seriously, and funds are made available.
That's interesting. Where do these funds come from? Is this all government funding, or is there private? I mean, how are?
Yeah, well, in terms of the foundations, like Susan B. Komen Foundation, of course, they raise money they support. They support projects, but also, more importantly, they support young researchers to become engaged in the field. They get fellowships from these different foundations. The government funding is critical. That's through the National Institutes of Health.
Right.
That's all peer-reviewed funding, so it's a very, very tightly reviewed.
Right.
Very difficult to get grants. At present, the funding rates are really quite low because more money needs to be put into the National Institutes of Health. But it's really that's the main driver. And then subsequently, you do get funding coming in from the pharmaceutical industry. So that funding tends to be later in the research area. So once a discovery has been made, and if there's a commercial promise for a drug, for example, or a diagnostic tool, then you will have engagement through medical diagnostics companies or pharmaceutical companies, and they'll get involved in perhaps supporting a clinical trial.
So here's what's interesting, or one of the things that's interesting to me is that as I'm listening to you describe the research process, so you have some group that identifies a particular cancer that is in need of research, then they attract, and I love this, young researchers into the field. And I assume that's because they need them to stay with the project for a period of time. Would that be correct?
That is correct, yes.
Because these are not things that can be resolved in a year or two frequently.
That's right. It's a long-term thing.
It's a very long-term. If you're young, then you can stay with it. Okay. Yeah. So then you apply for some sort of funding, whether it's from the government, or private sector, you get the funding. And then let's say that the research team develops a therapy and approach that looks effective. And let's say that it is something that a pharmaceutical company would then, if you will, they would pass the baton from the researchers to the pharmaceutical company. I assume that's part of the commercialization activity, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So one of the things, and again, this is just what I would call a popular and probably uninformed view, is that many of the drugs that come out of the pharmaceutical companies are priced very high for things like cancer treatment, some certain types of cancer treatment. And the response of the pharmaceutical company generally is, we've had to invest all this money in R&D and it's so risky and da-da-da-da-da. Talk a little bit about the economics, if you can, about that, because, it sounds like a lot of the risk has been borne by either the taxpayer or these private organizations who've been funding the early R&D by these, PhD, either students or graduates, whatever, like people like yourself, I mean, they've done a lot of the heavy lifting early on.
Yes, that's true, and I think that's an irritation to researchers. That is the case. They are relying on government funding through the National Institute of Health primarily,
Right.
but also through the private philanthropic organizations that we mentioned.
Right.
And that funds a lot of the discovery work.
Right.
And quite often it'll fund it right through to what's called early translation too. The NIH have grant programs that'll take it through to early translation. So this is looking to see if the discovery that you've made can be translated into an animal model. Now, what I mean by animal is usually a mouse.
Right.
And can you cure
Right.
the mouse from its cancer? And oftentimes you can. It doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be able to go on and then have a positive effect on a human being.
Right.
But it's that stage where it starts to get really tricky in terms of expense. So where does the money come from then to take it from those early mouse experiments? They'll give you a little bit of information on whether the approach is going to be safe, this new drug that you've identified.
Interesting.
Is it going to be safe?
Right.
Yes, well, it seems to be safe in a mouse, but, a mouse is a lot different from a human.
Right.
So then you have to move to clinical trials, and that's where it becomes very expensive. And that's when pharmaceutical industry tends to pick up the projects. And that is expensive. So when they're looking at drug pricing, they're trying to price all of those studies that they've had to undergo in the clinical trial phase of preparing a drug for approval by the FDA.
And that then is the, if you will, the high cost that they're attempting to recover in their early pricing.
That is correct. So normally what they'll do, you'll find more and more. So the models change over the years.
Right.
Pharma, the way it interacts with basic research.
Right.
There have been times when the pharmaceutical industry has invested in basic research programs by establishing close connections between universities and research institutes, and then having something called the first right of refusal for any discovery that comes along to develop it. The models has changed quite a bit more recently. What pharma are doing right at the moment is that they're going around and they're hoovering up all of these small biotech companies, because the small biotech companies then moved into that space. They were the ones then that took the discoveries that were made in universities and research institutes and then moved them forward to the proof of concept in a human studies.
Okay.
And then pharma comes along and says, "Oh, you've de-risked that project for us. Thank you.
Yep.
We'll take that one on now." And they've handled a bundle of money to the small biotech, or they've gobbled it up. They've decided to take it under their wing.
Yeah, in technology they call that an acqui-hire, where they actually acquire the entity, but they're really just trying to bring on all the team.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, so this is interesting. So from a process, and let's peel away the layers of the onion a little bit, because it's really fascinating. So you have, from a innovation development standpoint, you have the basic research today being done by researchers that are resident, in many cases at universities, maybe at private organizations like the ones you've run. And then it reaches a certain point where it's then handed off, if you will, to some early commercialization activity by what I want to call a niche biotech firm. Would that be correct?
I think that's a very accurate description of it.
So that firm then acquires capital from some sources, right?
Correct.
To enable them to further mature the technology that they've licensed, if you will, from the research entity. And then they in turn get, in many cases, acquired by big pharma, who comes along and says, to your point, well, you've de-risked it. Now you've got a variety of outcomes and models and tests and things that have validated that this is not only effective, but potentially, do any of these biotech firms, and I'm talking the early ones, do they do any human trials at all, or is that only done by big pharma?
They do. Sometimes they do get into human trials. It really depends on the particular. If you stick with cancer, the particular cancer that you're looking for. So if it's a rare cancer, they might get involved. But for cancers that are more common, it's unlikely because you need a lot more patients to enter into and the cost is much greater. But you have these points of inflection in the development of biotech companies in terms of when they can raise money.
Right.
So they need to start off. They need to have a good idea. They need to have licensed it in from a university or a research institute, and then they need to go out and then use that licensed product.
Right.
Let's say it's a small molecule drug, and they need to be able to then find somebody else that'll continue the funding. So this is when venture capitalists get involved.
Right.
Because the little biotech may have started with a friends and family type arrangement.
Right. Yep.
Now they get a venture capitalist involved, and they'll go out and do what's called a Series A round of funding. So that can be anything from a few million to $10 or $30 million.
Right.
And then it moves on from there. And that amount of money is almost enough to get them towards what's called an IND, an investigational drug application with the FDA. And once you get that allows you to do a clinical trial. Now that's a really strong point of inflection there. So at that stage, it's possible that pharma will come along and pick up that small biotech. But they might want to see the results of the first in human studies. Is it safe? So that's a phase 1, phase 2 study.
Right.
Phase 1 is just a safety trial. Is it safe?
Right.
Sometimes you get in phase 1 what's termed by oncologists a signal. So a signal that looks like it's promising.
Right.
But you can't report on that. You just report on the safety.
Right.
But then you'll do a phase 2 study, and a phase 2 study is to begin to test for efficacy. So does it really is it really active against this form of cancer? Then you start to get into some issues because you have the genetics of the population that will always impact on how a drug is metabolized, how it acts. There's individual variations.
Interesting.
So this is when the trials can start to become quite large.
And large and also expensive,
yeah,
correct?
That's right. And then if you move into phase 3, which is really to test for efficacy,
right,
then that becomes really expensive. So there's very few biotechs get involved at that stage unless they become a very large one, like Amgen or Genentech or Biogen or all of those ones that have been around for a long time. They've really become farmers,
right?
Pharmaceutical industry.
Yep, that's correct. So, this is interesting. So, for many of the biotech firms then, and I'll speak in, again, technology terms, the exit plan for the investors who funded, let's say, seed round, Series A, maybe even Series B, is sort of an M&A, is to be acquired by big pharma, who's then going to take that, if you will, that product on through that expensive testing phase, correct?
Yes, that is correct. They're always looking for, particularly the early investors, looking for an exit.
Yep.
But one of the things that early investors need to understand is, particularly in drug development, it takes a long time.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of patience. And you need to be able to stick with whatever company you've invested in. You need to be able to stay with them for that journey.
So, again, to put some context on this, what in the world of drug development, when you say long time, what does that mean? Just quantify that.
10 to 15 years.
Wow. Wow, that is a long time.
Yeah.
So that's well beyond the what I would call the return horizons of many people.
Correct.
Who are limited partner investors in venture funds because they're looking for an exit in 10 years, right?
Oh, yeah, or even sooner.
Right. With high multiples.
Yeah, they're looking for 10x or something, which is in my mind mostly unrealistic.
Yeah.
But and I just give you an example. So I've been involved with a Sydney, Australia-based company for something like 20 years now. I'm a director and shareholder of the company. But I was just a member of the scientific advisory board for a very long time. And then eventually they asked me to come on. When I stepped down in my institute director role, would I come on and be a director of their company?
Right.
And this company's been around for more than 20 years. It's still privately held by a group of very supportive investors in Sydney. And we have some very promising activity in cancers, particularly pancreatic cancer.
Oh, wow.
It's published work.
That's huge.
So what we found was that if we gave this particular form of therapy, and I won't describe it because it's complex, because it involves interactions with the immune system as well as using a highly active drug. So that combination therapy, we've found that we can extend the lives of pancreatic cancer patients by several months. And these patients have exhausted all other forms of therapy. So that's where we are now. So how do we move further on with that? Well, we have what's called a fast track designation with the FDA.
Right.
So that allows us to move it more quickly into a clinical trial situation. We have an IND with the FDA as well. Will we get acquired? It's not likely yet. We'll probably have to show that not in this phase 1, it was a phase 1, phase 2A trial.
Right.
We're going to have to show in a new trial that we're designing at the moment where we compare it with standard of care, and the standard of care is pretty serious drugs. We'll have to do a direct comparison with our therapeutic compared to the standard of care. So patients will have to go into either standard of care, our therapeutic, and there might even be a crossover in that during the course of that trial. That costs a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're embarking on now. Those trials will be carried out largely in the United States.
So let's talk about this again from a business standpoint. This is absolutely fascinating. So this company in Melbourne, correct?
Yes, no, this particular one's in Sydney.
In Sydney, okay.
Yes.
So we're in Sydney. We've developed this solution, this therapy. It's now time to test. Let's assume for a moment the company goes to that next step. The test is successful. How then would big pharma, regardless of where the entity is located, United States, Australia, it doesn't matter, how would they perform what I call the total available market for that therapy? In other words, because from a valuation standpoint, I mean, a ton of money has been invested in getting this solution to this phase. Yeah. But to take it across the finish line is going to take a lot more money.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
How are they going to value the research that's been done? How do they put a multiple, or do they put a multiple on that?
They don't. They tend not to. I mean, the company will get a value. So there's lots of organizations out there that'll give valuations on biotech companies. Okay. So they'll go out and say, what is the market for pancreatic cancer?
Right.
Well,
exactly.
It's quite large because it's there's a large unmet need there.
Right.
People die from the disease and they die rather quickly after being diagnosed.
Right.
And you know of some famous people who've passed away from that.
Yep.
So that's that. So they'll do it. They can do a valuation, and what you tend to do in companies is you'll go and look to see who's going to provide you with a valuation. They'll go out and see what the population is. They tend to focus sometimes just on the US market. Other companies like the Sydney-based company, we do a worldwide market because we have patent protection for all our technology in most countries that would potentially pick it up. So we're talking about Europe, and we're talking about Asia Pacific, China. All of those countries are covered. So that valuation is built into it. The valuation of the research that's already done really doesn't enter into it because it's only we're only talking about a few tens of millions of dollars compared to what the value is if you came out with a successful therapeutic. And this particular one's interesting because it is relatively inexpensive compared to a lot of the other therapies that have been offered. So it doesn't need to be tailored to individuals. It can be. It can be used to independent of any genetic makeup, independent of any autoimmune disease that somebody might have. It can be used. So it also costs a few cents to produce rather than many thousands of dollars to produce.
So now that's a really interesting detail. So from the standpoint of the acquiring entity, they're going to look at the size. Let's go with this, the pancreatic market, how many people are suffering from pancreatic cancer and who die, right? Yeah. So let's assume the total available market is, measured in probably maybe even tens, maybe hundreds of millions of people, right, globally?
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
Okay. So from a pricing standpoint, though, if the cost of goods sold of this is de minimis, right, cents as opposed to thousands of dollars, right? what is there any market incentive to get big pharma to reduce the cost of that drug upon delivery, given that the cost of goods sold is so low?
Yeah, that's a really important point, because using the same sort of technology for fighting, in the case I mentioned was pancreatic cancer.
Right.
We've also used that technology to develop a COVID vaccine, and this is published work as well. And so the COVID vaccine that we produced is a very, very active vaccine. In both cases, what we're trying to do is activate the innate immune system that I talked about at the beginning of our conversation. The innate, yes, that's right. So this we found out that we were able to do this and raise very, very good antibodies against SARS-CoV-2. And we were able to do that in people who had underlying autoimmune issues.
Oh, wow.
So they would not be able to develop robust immunity using any of the RNA vaccines, for example, or even the protein-based vaccines that were made available early on. So it's in that particular case, we're talking, again, cost of goods.
Yep.
We were talking about $4 a shot versus $45, $50 a shot for mRNA vaccines.
Right.
So huge difference.
Huge difference. An order of magnitude less expensive.
And then also a supply chain that didn't need a cold supply chain. Right.
I think Moderna was the one that you had to put in the freezer, wasn't it?
Correct.
Or Pfizer as well.
Yeah, they all require cool chain storage.
Got it. Okay.
And this one did not. It could be freeze dried, desiccated.
Wow.
And then you could take it to wherever you're going to run out your vaccination program. You just resuspend it in an appropriate saline and buffer, and then it's just an intramuscular injection like the other ones. And that vaccine promotes what we call long-lived B cell memory. So what's that? Well, B cells are the cells that produce antibodies against an antigen. In this case, the antibodies would be against the spike protein of the coronavirus. And so these long-lived antibodies, they last a lot longer than any of the antibodies that are produced by the mRNA vaccines. They tend to run out. They tend to diminish very quickly within a matter of months. The antibodies that we're producing.
It's the reason for the boost. They've been promoting boosters.
That's right. So you've got to look. So where's the profit in that? Then I'm putting the question back to you.
Yeah.
Where's the profit? Well, in some cases, there's more than profit involved in this. You need to be able to tackle virus infections worldwide.
Right.
Remember that SARS-CoV-2 originated in Wuhan.
Right.
Okay, and then it spread around the world.
Right.
So we need to be able to and we know that monkeypox now is in Africa.
Right.
Okay, and it's now starting to spread, although because it's restricted in terms of the individuals that are infected, we're unlikely to see that being a major problem. But flu is always a major problem for
absolutely.
Every year. So you need to be able to have vaccines distributed effectively, efficiently, and at low cost beyond the countries that we live in, myself, Australia,
and
you, the United States.
Right.
Yes. So it becomes more than an economic argument.
Well, I would agree with you, and I think that's kind of where I was headed, is that there are a number of people, well, let me speak as a United States citizen, with the cost of healthcare consuming almost 20% of our gross domestic product, right? It's just incredibly expensive. People say it's the best healthcare in the world. That may be true, maybe not. I don't know. I haven't done, the cost-benefit analysis, but I will say that for us as citizens, it's extremely expensive. And one of the concerns that people have is that the profit incentive and driver in that chain of innovation that you were describing a few minutes ago leads to a situation where if I price something based on just demand, which is the market way to do it, right? So high demand, and then I were to say to somebody, what is it worth for you to take this and not die? Right, and not die for 6 months or extend your life for a year. What are you willing to pay for an additional 6 months of life, a year of life, right? Which is a way of pricing, right? It's market demand, right?
Correct.
There's other people that would argue that ethically that's inappropriate.
Yes.
Would you?
Yeah. Look, I think yes, that's right, but it depends. Really, it's an individual decision. Let me just give an example of something that is not widely practiced in the US, but is practiced in every state in Australia. That's VAD, voluntary assisted dying.
Yes.
Right. So
Right.
that is offered
Right.
in every state in Australia now,
Right.
and there are strict criteria
Sure.
about that. So you have that's at one extreme.
Right.
The other extreme, you can be offered a very expensive form of therapy, like you've probably heard about cellular immunotherapies.
I've not. No.
Well, they cost hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Oh my gosh.
This is when you can take a particular cell from an individual. These are usually called T cells. So they're
Yes.
the cells, the virus-fighting cells, but they also fight cancer. You
Right.
can modify them in the laboratory. You can't, and then you put them back into the same individual. So you arm them so they're then able to attack the cancer. You put them back into the same individual, and it's been really quite successful now in what we call liquid cancers. So we're talking about leukemias, for example, lymphomas. So we've had a lot of reasonable success there, but it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to be treated with this form of therapy. Very labor intensive. There've been changes now coming along that might make it a little bit cheaper, but it's going to take some time. So you've got those two extremes.
Yeah.
You have, you're going to the physician, it could be the oncologist, and then whomever else is advising the patient. You do not have long to live here. Any form of therapeutic that we give you may make you very ill, and the last few months of your life will not be very will be neither be productive nor pleasant, comfortable.
Right,
That's right. And that's a real dilemma in terms of cancer, because trying to make patients comfortable during the last part of their journey is really, really difficult. So you've got that as opposed to, well, we give you this really expensive form of therapy, and it's actually relatively safe. We now know that, but it may only extend your life by a year.
Right.
And then you're faced with the same sort of dilemma.
Yeah, these are really tough existential questions.
They are.
And
Yeah.
and I want to point out, because I'm sure some listeners would come after me with pitchforks if I were to suggest that the capital that the markets are it's an inappropriate use of the free market technology for drugs and innovation. It's a way, the free market does have a way, obviously, of determining where's the efficient use of the capital.
That's correct.
So that is important. So there are some early research efforts, that are by these biotech firms that it may be something that's interesting, novel. It's a kind of therapy that's needed, but the amount of capital could be just outrageous, or the time frame may be longer than what investors are prepared to fund, right? So the marketplace is sort of allocating, if you will, where the capital belongs, right? I think the question that I was really driving at, which you've answered, is, well, what happens when Big Pharma takes something and the cost of goods sold are low, right? Would there be some sort of mechanism to say, okay, after you've recaptured this significant ROI on your investment, right? You've acquired the biotech firm,
right.
You've done the testing and so forth, and you've released the drug, and maybe for the first year you charge this amount of money, right?
Right.
But after a couple of 3 years, when you've recaptured a multiple of your investment, right? You then start, because the problem is with intellectual property, and this with patents in the United States anyway, you got 17 years of protection.
Right.
Big Pharma can just hold the price high because nobody can come in with a competitive alternative.
That's right. You can't get a generic into the game.
That's right.
But it's sort of so the other way to put your question is, why would you go after a generic? Why do companies build generics? They're making money out of the generics at a much lower price. Right.
Exactly.
So that's it's interesting from that point of view. So it's a really different way of looking at how you make your money as a pharmaceutical company. But I think that there's already change. So the present government here have been quite successful in getting decreases in prices of some drugs recently.
Right.
So I think that's been a very positive move, and that's done in discussions with pharma, and they've managed to get a cap put on prices of drugs that were really very expensive, getting them to the state where they can be administered to more people at a much more reasonable rate. I think that's kind of set. As long as that move keeps on going, I think we'll see much more engagement between pharma and government in terms of pricing. The issue they have in the United States is the underinsured population or non-insured population. I mean, how do you deal with them? That's really tough. Well, there are models out there though. Australia's not a bad model. It has a mixed model. So you have private health insurance. Everybody's encouraged to get private health insurance through a small tax write-off, but you're encouraged to get that. And then the healthcare system there is pretty good. I would rate it as high as the US. Actually, I've experienced both healthcare systems.
It's a public healthcare system.
No, well, everybody gets treatment. There's not a problem with that. I mean, when you take out private insurance, you can get treated privately. So most physicians and surgeons will have their hospital visits where they tend to their hospital patients, public hospital patients, and they'll also have a private clinic. So that way it remains competitive. It's not like Canada. The Canadian provinces have different systems, but I was familiar with the Ontario system, and there that was all public. There were very little private offerings there. So you got a lot of doctors moving south to the US so they could increase their income.
Sure.
So so there are other models out there where health is normally costly to any government, and sometimes the governments get it wrong, and you can see that in the UK at the moment, where their healthcare system, the national healthcare system, is really in a terrible mess. It's really staff underpaid, patients not treated effectively and efficiently, and really the system is pretty much broken. They've got a new government there, but I think they'll struggle to fix that system because it was let to go after 14 years of rule by the previous Conservative government, and so it's a tough situation. I think things have improved here in the US, but I know when I come here, I can't get treatment for an existing condition. For example, I have to pay out of pocket, and boy, the out of pockets are quite expensive. You could pretty soon run through your funds.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's one of the problems.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, because I guess the question I have about this whole innovation process that we've described, is the U.S. or the U.S., Australia, New Zealand, U.K., et cetera, are they sort of do they have a corner on the market for new drug therapy innovation, or are there models that work in other parts of the world?
Like I think the U.S. still is the major player here by quite a long way, and that's because of the amount of money that's spent on the early discovery research.
Okay.
And I'm just focusing on discovery research in healthcare. So that's one reason. China are making enormous strides. The amount of funds they're putting into research in the health sector is enormous, and they do run a lot more clinical trials now than they've ever run. They're not quite so inventive when it comes to being able to take their new discoveries and move them into companies, although they've been doing it quite efficiently. But their economy now is not doing too well.
That's right.
So it'll be interesting to see how much they continue to spend money in this area. But I think the United States is still number one. Europe is different, of course, because you've got many countries involved, and each country is a little bit different in terms of the amount of funds that they spend on basic discovery research and clinical research.
What do you see are the sort of the next wave of innovation as it relates to cancer therapies, cancer treatments? What do you see happening? What's
I think the biggest, probably one of the earliest changes that we're seeing already is in the use of AI in image detection, in imaging. So that is really starting to impact. And with AI, the more information that goes into AI, the better it becomes. So it's a self-training, perpetuating thing. So I think that's certainly already having an impact, and it's going to replace a lot of what we tend to do in a standard pathology lab. Again, just referring to cancer, when you're looking at staining slides on a
Oh,
sort of
interesting.
standing microscope slide and looking down a microscope.
Right.
So that's already having an impact. I mean, the other impact kind of is in the area of cellular immunotherapies that I mentioned before. So there's a lot of activity going on there. It's actually I mentioned that there are some really positive results in terms of the leukemias, lymphomas, and so on. So the so-called liquid tumors. Mm-hmm. It's been very, very difficult to see the same effect in solid cancers, colorectal cancer, bladder cancer, lung cancer, and so on. But there are going to be changes there as well. And in addition to those cellular immunotherapies, there's also antibody-mediated therapy. So these are the so-called checkpoint inhibitor therapy. So there are certain aspects of the immune system that really prevent it from being activated when you really want to activate it against a tumor. But now we've got antibodies that can be administered systemically, a shot in the arm or an IV through an IV line, and they can overcome those resistance mechanisms. So they're having an impact in the liquid cancers I mentioned before, but we're starting to learn how to use them in the solid tumors.
Wow.
Yeah.
In a conversation we had previously, one of the things that you mentioned to me that was beginning to alarm cancer researchers is the rising incidence of cancer among younger people. Mm-hmm. Other than that being true, are there any observations that anybody has made as to why this is happening?
Yeah, there's some good studies that have been being published this year, just focusing in particular areas. For example, focusing on pesticides. So we've known for a long time that different pesticides have been proven to lead to certain cancers. Malathion would be one of them you're probably familiar with, using it for spraying apples and things like that,
right.
and having to stop that. But there are a lot of others. Glyphosate, Roundup is widely used. It's used in Australia. I'm not sure what the situation is in the US now. I haven't found out. But in European countries, they've blocked it. Some of the European countries, EU, have blocked Roundup. The link of Roundup to cancer, glyphosate to cancer is a little bit tenuous. But certainly, there's pesticides and environmental influences are impacting on this. And the other things that are impacting on seeing an increase we're looking at increases in cancers that were really quite rare amongst young people. Colorectal cancer is an example of that. You didn't normally see that until much later, but now you're seeing cases very, very early on. So why is that? Well, it's a whole diet and lifestyle change.
Right.
Moving to diets, like the diets here in the United States is probably they're the most infamous.
Right.
I think I was at a deli yesterday for lunch, and I could see why people were eating for lunch.
Right.
The very, very large corned beef sandwich. So hadn't seen one so large for a long time. But also sugary drinks. The sedentary lifestyle is really, I think that's got a lot to do with it. So because diet and exercise, the decrease in the amount of diet and exercise, and obesity accompanied with the increase in obesity. So how is the increase in obesity linked to cancer? Well, there's a very strong link between obesity and liver cancer.
Oh, interesting.
So you thought, well, why didn't we know that before? Because Americans have a reputation for being rather large and eating a lot of food.
Right.
But really I think the revelation here has been in England, of all places, where when I lived there in the 70s, most of the English were not overfed, they were thin,
right?
And there wasn't a lot of there was some unhealthy food, but there certainly wasn't a lot of takeout food, fast food, and things like that. And what there was Wimpy Bar or something. It was pretty horrible hamburgers.
Right.
But that's changed enormously now. There's an obesity almost epidemic in England now, and an increase in liver cancer. Very strong link there between obesity and liver cancer. So it's not a great situation.
So then, for listeners who are wondering, I suppose you've really responded head on to this question of the relationship between, these metabolic situations. So the lack of exercise, the lack of, or too sugary drinks, processed food, those sorts of things really are drivers of cancers later in life, correct?
Well, earlier in life.
Yeah.
Certainly later in life, but now earlier in life. And it's probably, it's a bit hard to make to make firm connections, but the body of evidence is starting to accumulate that says that if you take all this together, that's what the underlying cause in the increase in younger people. Yeah.
Wow. Well, Bryan, thank you so much for your time today. This has been really educational. I mean, we've covered a wide range of topics, but I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed it.
All righty. I'm Mark Good. You've been listening to Remarkable.